Our first lesson this morning is from Matthew 2. I'm going to be reading verses 1 through 12. This is a continuance of the birth story, and Matthew tells us that not long after the birth of Jesus, the Holy Family had some very surprising visitors. Now, we don't really know, the time span isn't clear if Jesus is still an infant or if he was a young toddler. And this kind of reminds me of something that Mark and I watched. And it was the birth story, and it was told by Kevin Costner. It was on TV, and that was really interesting for us because it kind of dealt with the time span, that maybe kind of gave a different opinion of when things happened and when the special visitors came. After Jesus' birth, which happened in Bethlehem of Judea during the reign of Herod, astrologers from the east arrived in Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the newborn ruler of the Jews? We observed his star at its rising and have come to pay homage." At this news, Herod became greatly disturbed, as did all of Jerusalem. Summoning all the chief priests and religious scholars of the people, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they informed him. "Here is what the prophet has written. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, since from you will come a ruler who is to shepherd my people, Israel." Herod called the astrologers aside and found them from the exact time of the star's appearance and found out from them. Then he sent them to Bethlehem after having instructed them, "Go and get detailed information about this child. When you have found him, report back to me so that I may go and offer homage too." After their audience with the ruler, they set out. The star which they had observed at its rising went ahead of them until it came to a standstill over the place where the child lay. They were overjoyed at seeing the star, and upon entering the house, found the child with Mary, his mother. They prostrated themselves and paid homage. Then they opened their coffers and presented the child with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, so they went back to their own country by another route. Matthew's story continues, telling us that Jesus and his family became refugees as they fled from the dictator's bloodthirsty desire to remain in power. After the astrologers had left, the angel of God suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph with the command, "Get up and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you otherwise. Herod is searching for the child to destroy him." Joseph got up, awakened Jesus and Mary, and they left that night for Egypt. They stayed there until the death of Herod, to fulfill what God had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my own." Herod became furious when he realized that the astrologers had outwitted him. He gave orders to kill all male children that were 2 years old and younger, living in and around Bethlehem. The age of the children was based on the date Herod had learned from the astrologers. Then what was spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, sobbing and lamenting loudly. It was Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled, for they were no more. After Herod's death, the angel of God appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt with the command, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and set out for the land of Israel. Those who had designs on the life of the child are dead." Joseph got up, awakened Jesus and Mary, and they returned to the land of Israel. Joseph heard, however, that Archelaus had succeeded Herod as ruler of Judea. and Joseph was afraid to go back there. Instead, because of a warning received by Joseph in a dream, the family went to the region of Galilee. There they settled in a town called Nazareth. In this way, what was said through the prophets was fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene.
The first part of our reading from Matthew is kind of cute, especially if you gloss over Herod's emotional reaction. Foreigners from the east arrive at the Jewish capital, Jerusalem, because they think a new king has been born. Apparently, the foreigners were somewhere between astronomers and astrologers. Like astronomers, they watched the night sky, paying attention to what they saw. Like astrologers, they thought that what they saw could be interpreted in a way that would help them understand what was going on here on earth. These skywatchers saw a star that made them think that a new Jewish king had been born. So they journeyed to Jerusalem to pay homage to this new king. All of this is very sweet, especially, as I said, if you gloss over Herod's emotional reaction, if you jump right to Herod's ignorance of his own faith, that he had to call together the chief priests and biblical scholars of his time to find out where the Messiah was going to be born. I would have thought that just about anybody who was living under Roman oppression would have known where the Messiah was supposed to be born. They were waiting for the Messiah to come and free them, but not Herod. He wasn't paying attention to that stuff because he liked the status quo. He was doing just fine. But there is Herod's emotional reaction. He is disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him, by the announcement of these skywatchers. The new king means that his position of comfort with the status quo is threatened. Thus, we know that when Herod tells the visitors to report back to him, once they've gone to Bethlehem and they find out all the details, report back to him about this child so that Herod may go and pay homage, we all know that he's lying. When the skywatchers get to Bethlehem, they find Joseph and Mary's home. They bow down before the child, who may be a young toddler, as Ricky said, present their gifts. It's sort of the type of thing you'd expect ambassadors to do when a new king is born. And then they go home by another way. They avoid Jerusalem, Herod. When I was a child, my grandfather would read a blended nativity story from the family Bible to the family as on Christmas Eve. He'd read Luke's version of the birth of Jesus, and then he would turn over and read these first 12 verses from the second chapter of Matthew's Gospel. And he would stop the reading where the skywatchers go home by another way. I think he would stop there because the next 7 verses tell a disturbing story. While there's no historical evidence that any of this actually happened, what is described in our scriptures is very much in keeping with Herod's personality. It's believed that Herod killed some of his own children and a wife to protect his throne, ordering the slaughter of all the male children in Bethlehem to protect his throne is in keeping with that character. And that's why the Holy Family had to escape. Their lives were threatened, and so they were on the run. They run to a foreign country. They ran to Egypt and seek refuge there. I can't think or read this story without thinking of a poem called Home by the Somali British poet Warsan Shire. A poem that starts, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run to the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. The boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory. is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. The way Luke tells the story, Mary and Joseph were unhoused when Jesus was born. His first vulnerable days were not spent in a hospital or a home, but in a makeshift, improvised shelter. The way Matthew tells the story, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus were refugees. There was no accident, no minor detail in the Christmas story. Matthew begins his story with the Holy Family running, going to a foreign country as refugees. That's how Matthew begins the gospel. And the last story Jesus tells, the last bit of teaching before his arrest, is a parable. Jesus tells a story that puts the premium not on any particular confession of faith, but rather on whether or not we serve the least of these, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and also, and in particular, welcoming the stranger. Jesus explicitly takes up solidarity with those who need the basics of food, clothing, and shelter in this parable, as if to say, if you're looking for me, look for the most vulnerable. Jesus starts his gospel by saying Jesus was a refugee. And he ends his gospel by saying that Jesus is a refugee. This story echoes in contemporary America so profoundly and on so many fronts. The cruelty of the Department of Homeland Security, particularly through the actions of ICE and Customs and Border Protection, are an obvious place where this story echoes. If this administration truly embraced Christian values, ICE and Customs and Border Protection would be seeking ways to welcome and protect people who come to this country seeking refuge. Instead, they act like Herod's troops rounding up children in Bethlehem. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is playing the exact role of Herod as he upends decades of established vaccine practices and puts infants and children at risk. Ignoring the science, Secretary Kennedy has made outrageous claims that the hepatitis B birth dose is a likely culprit of autism. My colleague and scholar, the Reverend Dr. Susan Thistlethwaite, summarizes it this way. The health and well-being of children is being put at grave risk to further gin up conspiracy theories that have no basis in fact. She concludes that this is happening to sow fear and distrust. Sowing fear and distrust of the government is the point, as is frankly killing off poor and underserved young children. Children from low-income families, those without health insurance or who are underinsured, as well as Native American children who have long had access to life-saving vaccines through Vaccines for Children program, established decades ago as part of Medicaid. However, that access is under threat by RFK Jr. And then there are the direct killings being perpetrated by our government. Trump's attack on Venezuelan boats and the homicides of the people on board who are clinging to parts of boats after their boat has been shattered by American missiles are corroding America's soul. Again, Dr. Thistlethwaite, writing back in 2004 about the Iraq War, wrote this: "The soul of a nation, like the soul of an individual, is the root from which all decency arises. It is the basis of any desire to behave according to our collective expressed values. And we as a nation have lost this. We are a nation that tortures prisoners. There's a breakdown between our expressed values of democracy and human rights and the torture of Iraqis. More recently, she's pointed out that the American people have been morally damaged by this torture program, as many now accept torture as sometimes justified. Astonishingly, the more you attend church, the more likely you are to believe that torture can be justified. According to a Pew study in 2009, more than half of the people who attend worship at least once a week, 54%, said that using torture on suspected terrorists was often or sometimes justified. Trump and his minions count the destruction of the American soul, and clearly conservative Christianity is a big help with that, in order to further corrupt whatever is left of our strongest values. Sure, killing survivors clinging to a boat you just bombed is fine if you have no soul. Our Advent and Christmas worship series has been a look behind the scene, a look beyond the scene that is depicted in the creches that decorate our sanctuary and living rooms. We've let the Christmas carol, "What Child Is This?" call us to examine who we think Jesus is, this Jesus we say we follow when we declare that we are Christians. We've done this by looking at the reality of the violence, oppression, and injustice of the society into which Jesus was born. And we've learned some things. Who is this Jesus? This Jesus is a king unlike any earthly king or tyrant. He is the anti-emperor. Jesus is a silent, pleading word. Jesus is the child of the justice prophet Mary. Jesus is the one who is enthroned by love. Jesus is as vulnerable and world-changing as a baby. Jesus is a refugee. This is the Jesus we follow. At last Monday afternoon Bible study, I asked what the good news in this story was, and we agreed that there is good news anytime a family escapes violence and finds refuge. We agreed that there's good news in the wise men, the skywatchers, choosing not to return to Herod, but choosing to go home by another way. And we agreed that there's good news in the idea that we can be like the skywatchers and resist the tyrants at work today. The poet John Rodell tells us how to do that resistance. We keep allowing violence to pass as normal, but every time we choose compassion, we jam up the great war machine. Love is not softness. Love is resistance, and I will step into it. Amen.